Dearest listeners, there exists a peculiar paradox in the marriage mart of London society. The more desperately one seeks love, the more elusive it becomes, whilst those who retreat into the shadows often find themselves illuminated by the most unexpected light. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of two souls who attended every obligation of the season whilst hiding their truest selves, only to discover that authenticity, not performance, holds the key to lasting devotion. If such stories capture your heart, do show your appreciation with a like and subscribe so that you never miss a single chronicle from the heart of the Tun. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the most intricate embroidery, must be revealed stitch by stitch. The spring of 1816 arrived in London with its customary fanfare, bringing with it the glittering machinery of the season and all its attendant rituals. Lady Penelope Hartwick stood before the tall windows of her family's Berkeley Square townhouse, watching the endless parade of carriages below with an expression that might have been mistaken for serene contemplation by those who did not know her well. Her elder sisters, now comfortably established in their own households with children beginning to fill their nurseries, would have recognized the set of her shoulders for what it truly was: resignation dressed in silk and propriety. At 21, Penelope occupied that peculiar position of being neither a fresh-faced debutante nor yet upon the shelf. As the third daughter of the Earl of Grantley, she possessed all the advantages one might expect: a respectable dowry of £15,000, connections to several prominent families, and a face that, whilst not arresting in the manner of her eldest sister's classical beauty, held a quality of intelligent warmth that grew more appealing upon longer acquaintance. Her hair, the color of burnished chestnuts, refused to hold the fashionable ringlets her maid labored over each morning, instead falling in softer waves that framed features marked by observation rather than vanity. What set Penelope apart from the other young ladies navigating the treacherous waters of the marriage mart was not any deficiency in accomplishments or deportment, but rather an unfortunate tendency toward authenticity. 3 seasons in London, society had not dulled her ability to perceive the calculated nature of social intercourse, the way conversations followed predictable patterns like dancers executing a well-rehearsed quadrille. She had learned to perform her part with adequate grace, but the performance itself had grown increasingly exhausting. Her mother, the Countess of Grantley, had initially attributed this reticence to natural shyness, then to excessive standards, and finally to a regrettable streak of romanticism that she blamed upon Penelope's fondness for novels. The truth, had anyone bothered to inquire deeply enough, was simpler and more damning. Penelope had discovered that most gentlemen of the Tun viewed marriage as a transaction no different from the purchase of a thoroughbred horse or a particularly fine piece of property. They assessed her dowry, her connections, and her childbearing hips with the same dispassionate calculation they might bring to evaluating an investment in the funds. To escape the frivolity of her required social routine, Penelope often sought refuge in her father's library, not with the novels her mother disapproved of, but with the estate ledgers and agricultural journals. She had developed a quiet talent for figures and a genuine curiosity about land management practices, finding more satisfaction in understanding the logic of crop rotation than in mastering a new piece at the pianoforte. Her father, the Earl, had remarked more than once that Penelope possessed a head for estate administration sharper than that of his own steward, though such observations were made privately and never in her mother's hearing. The previous season had brought a proposal from Viscount Delamere, a gentleman of impeccable lineage and adequate fortune whose conversation never strayed beyond horses, hunting, and the management of his estates. Penelope had declined with all appropriate gratitude, earning herself a lecture from her mother about the folly of expecting romantic passion in a suitable match. The season before that had seen the attentions of Mr. Edmund Fairfax, a second son with parliamentary ambitions who had spent their every conversation using her as an audience for his political theories, never once inquiring about her own thoughts or interests. That rejection had prompted her father to suggest, with uncharacteristic sharpness, that she might consider the practical realities of her position. The difficulty, Penelope had come to understand, lay not in attracting suitors, but in finding one who saw her as more than a collection of assets and accomplishments. She wanted what her sisters had found through fortunate chance rather than design, a partnership built upon genuine regard and compatibility. Her eldest sister Margaret had discovered such happiness with her scholarly husband, whilst her middle sister Dorothea had found unexpected joy with a widower whose first marriage had taught him the value of true companionship. That such matches were rare made them no less desirable in Penelope's estimation. This season, her fourth and likely her last before society began to whisper about her prospects with pitying undertones, her mother had adopted a new strategy. Rather than pushing Penelope toward any particular gentleman, the Countess had instead engineered their attendance at every significant social event, creating what she called opportunities for serendipity. The result was an exhausting schedule of morning calls, afternoon promenades, musicales, card parties, dinners, and balls that left Penelope feeling rather like a prize mare being paraded at Tattersall's. On this particular afternoon in early May, Penelope faced the prospect of yet another ball, this one hosted by Lady Somerton at her magnificent residence in Grosvenor Square. The event promised to be one of the season's more significant crushes, with rumors circulating that several eligible gentlemen would be in attendance, including the newly elevated Duke of Radcliffe, about whom the gossips had been speculating with unusual intensity. The late Duke, by all accounts a jovial gentleman known for his love of good wine and better company, had suffered a fatal apoplexy whilst attending a prize fight the previous autumn. His unexpected death had thrust the title upon his younger brother, a gentleman who had previously occupied himself with managing the family's extensive northern estates and had rarely appeared in London society. The whispers suggested he was scholarly, reserved, and possessed of considerable personal wealth beyond the dukedom's already substantial holdings. More significantly for the marriage-minded mamas of the ton, he was unmarried and had no acknowledged connections to any lady. Penelope held little hope that this mysterious duke would prove any different from the parade of gentlemen she had already encountered. Titles, she had observed, often magnified rather than diminished the tendency toward arrogance and self-importance. Still, the evening ahead required her participation, and she had long since learned that resistance to her mother's social campaign only prolonged everyone's discomfort. Her maid, the patient and practical Sarah, had laid out her gown for the evening, a creation in pale gold silk that caught the light beautifully and complemented her coloring far better than the insipid whites and pastels deemed appropriate for younger debutantes. At least, Penelope thought with a touch of wry humor, her advancing age granted her some freedoms in dress, if not in circumstance. As she turned from the window to begin her preparations, Penelope caught sight of her reflection in the pier glass. The face that looked back at her was pleasant enough, she supposed, though she saw in it the same quality that she suspected kept suitors at a certain distance. Her eyes, gray-green and unusually direct, held an intelligence that society generally preferred to overlook in young ladies. She had learned to soften her gaze in company, to affect the sort of gentle, receptive expression that put gentlemen at ease. But the effort of maintaining such artifice had begun to feel unbearable. Perhaps she allowed herself to think as Sarah began the lengthy process of arranging her hair. This would be the season when she finally accepted the truth her mother had been trying to impress upon her. That romantic love, the kind celebrated in novels and poetry, was the province of fiction rather than reality. Perhaps it was time to evaluate potential husbands with the same practical calculation they applied to her, selecting the least objectionable option and building what contentment she could within the confines of duty and propriety. The thought settled upon her spirits like a heavy cloak, weighing down something vital that had, until now, remained stubbornly hopeful despite all evidence to the contrary. How much she had been clinging to the possibility of finding genuine connection until she contemplated abandoning the search entirely. Lady Somerton's ballroom blazed with the light of 3 enormous chandeliers, their countless candles reflected infinitely in the gilt-framed mirrors that lined the silk-covered walls. The crush of bodies, all dressed in their finest, created a warmth that the opened windows did little to alleviate, and the mingled scents of perfume, pomade, and hothouse flowers hung heavily in the air. The orchestra, positioned in the gallery above, filled the space with the opening strains of a country dance, and the floor quickly filled with couples moving through the familiar patterns with varying degrees of grace. Penelope stood near one of the windows, seeking what relief the evening air might provide, whilst maintaining the appearance of pleasant accessibility that her mother's pointed looks demanded. She had already danced twice that evening, once with Lord Hampton, whose conversation consisted entirely of complaints about the service of his dinner the previous evening, and once with Sir Philip Garnett, who had spent the entirety of their dance explaining his theories about crop rotation, with an enthusiasm she might have found charming had he shown even the slightest interest in her responses. Her mother, positioned strategically near Lady Somerton, was engaged in the sort of animated conversation that suggested matchmaking schemes in progress. Penelope recognized the particular tilt of the Countess's head that indicated she was gathering intelligence about potential suitors, and she suppressed a sigh. The evening stretched before her with the inevitability of all such events. More dances with more gentlemen who would see in her only what they wished to find, followed by her mother's hopeful interrogation during the carriage ride home. And then the whole exhausting cycle would begin again tomorrow. It was whilst she stood thus, contemplating her escape to the retiring room where she might claim a headache and beg to be taken home early, that Penelope first became aware of Richard Wentworth, Duke of Radcliffe, though she did not yet know his identity. He stood in the shadows near the card-room entrance, a position that placed him technically within the ballroom but clearly separate from its social swirl. His evening dress was impeccable, his cravat tied in an elegant mathematical that suggested both skill and restraint, but his entire bearing communicated a profound reluctance to engage with his surroundings. Whilst other gentlemen moved through the crowd with the confidence of long familiarity or the calculated charm of those seeking to impress, this gentleman held himself with a stillness that suggested he was enduring rather than enjoying the evening's festivities. What captured Penelope's attention, however, was not his obvious discomfort, but rather the expression on his face as he observed the dancers. It was a look she recognized intimately, because she had caught similar expressions on her own face in unguarded moments, a mixture of loneliness and longing, of wanting connection whilst simultaneously doubting its possibility. Here was someone, she thought with a sudden shock of recognition, who understood the particular isolation of being surrounded by people whilst feeling fundamentally alone. He was handsome in a way that would not immediately catch the eye in a crowded ballroom. His features were strong rather than pretty, with a straight nose, a firm jaw, and dark hair that showed a tendency toward unruliness despite obvious attempts to tame it. His height exceeded average by several inches, and his shoulders suggested a man who spent time engaged in physical pursuits rather than merely adorning drawing rooms. But it was his eyes, dark and remarkably expressive when he thought himself unobserved, that held her attention. In them, she saw a depth of feeling that the careful neutrality of his expression attempted to conceal. As though sensing her observation, he turned his head, and their gazes met across the crowded room. The moment stretched longer than propriety strictly allowed, both of them caught in that peculiar suspension that occurs when two souls recognize something essential in each other. Penelope felt heat rise in her cheeks, but could not seem to look away, and she saw surprise, then interest, then something more complicated pass across his features before he schooled them back into careful neutrality. The spell broke when Lady Somerton herself materialized at the gentleman's elbow, speaking to him with the particular animation hostesses reserved for their most important guests. Penelope watched as he responded with courtesy, but without enthusiasm, his attention repeatedly drifting back toward where she stood. When Lady Somerton began to guide him in her direction, Penelope experienced a sudden flutter of nerves entirely unlike her usual composure. "Lady Penelope," Lady Somerton announced with evident satisfaction, "I am delighted to present to you the Duke of Radcliffe, Your Grace, Lady Penelope Hartwick, daughter of the Earl of Grantley." Penelope executed a curtsy of exactly the proper depth for a duke, whilst he bowed with a precision that suggested both breeding and discomfort. When he straightened, their eyes met again, and she saw in his expression the same conflicted mixture of interest and wariness that she suspected showed in her own. "Lady Penelope," he said, and his voice proved as compelling as his appearance, deep and cultured with an undertone of warmth that his formal manner could not quite suppress. "I wonder if you might honor me with the next dance." The request, whilst entirely conventional, held an urgency that transformed it into something more significant. Penelope was aware of her mother's delighted expression, of Lady Somerton's knowing smile, of the sudden interested attention of several other mammas whose daughters had not yet secured a dance with the evening's most eligible gentleman. But more than any of that, she was aware of the Duke himself, of the way he seemed to be silently pleading with her to rescue him from something he could not name. "I would be pleased, Your Grace," she heard herself say, and watched relief flash across his features before he offered his arm to lead her to the floor. The orchestra had struck up a waltz, that still scandalous dance that required closer proximity than the safer country dances. As the Duke's hand settled at her waist and she placed her own upon his shoulder, Penelope became acutely conscious of his height, his warmth, and the surprising gentleness of his touch. They began to move, and she discovered that he danced with the same quiet competence that marked his bearing, leading her through the steps without the showmanship some gentlemen affected, but with an assurance that made following effortless. For several moments they circled the floor in silence, and Penelope found herself hyper-aware of every point of contact, of the way his breath stirred the curls near her temple, of the measured beat of his heart that she could almost feel through their joined hands. The usual chatter of polite conversation seemed impossible, inadequate for whatever was passing between them in these charged moments of proximity. "I confess," he said at last, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear, "I had quite determined to avoid dancing this evening entirely." Lady Somerton proved remarkably persistent. There was something in his tone, a rueful humor that invited conspiracy rather than demanding sympathy, that made Penelope respond with more honesty than wisdom strictly allowed. "I understand the feeling entirely. I have spent the better part of 3 seasons perfecting the art of appearing available whilst hoping desperately that no one will actually approach." She felt him stumble slightly in surprise at her candor, and then, to her amazement, he laughed. It was a quiet sound, quickly suppressed, but genuine in a way that transformed his entire countenance. For just a moment, the careful mask dropped, and she saw in his face something unguarded and achingly real. "That is—" He paused, as though searching for the right words. "The most honest thing anyone has said to me in months, possibly years. Most young ladies seem determined to convince me of their enthusiasm for social gatherings." "Most young ladies," Penelope replied, emboldened by his response, "are attempting to secure advantageous marriages. Enthusiasm for balls is considered an attractive quality, rather like proficiency at the pianoforte or excellence in watercolors. One performs it, whether one feels it or not. And you do not seek an advantageous marriage?" The question held genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "I seek a genuine partnership," she said carefully, aware that she was treading into dangerous territory, but unable to retreat into safer pleasantries. "I have discovered that advantage, as society defines it, often has little to do with actual happiness. But such views are considered romantical and impractical, so I generally keep them to myself." He was silent for a moment, and she feared she had revealed too much, that he would now categorize her as one of those tiresome bluestockings who failed to understand the realities of their position. But when he spoke again, his voice held a quality of wonder that made her breath catch. "You are—" He stopped, shook his head slightly as though amazed by his own words. "Utterly unlike anyone I have encountered in London. I had thought myself the only person here who felt like an actor in a play whose lines I could never quite remember." The music was drawing to a close, their waltz ending far too quickly, and Penelope felt a desperate need to extend this unexpected connection. Perhaps, she ventured, we might continue this conversation. That is, if you do not find such directness too shocking in a lady. His hand tightened briefly at her waist before propriety demanded he release her. I find it refreshing beyond measure, but I fear I must navigate several more obligations this evening before I can claim any extended conversation. Might I? He hesitated, vulnerability showing clearly in his expression. Might I call upon you tomorrow? I suspect we have much more to discuss. I would welcome that, Your Grace, Penelope replied, executing her curtsy as the dance ended, acutely aware of the interested gazes fixed upon them from all corners of the ballroom. As he escorted her back to where her mother waited, both of them carefully silent but thrumming with awareness, Penelope felt something shift in her chest, like a door that had been locked for self-protection suddenly swinging open. Here, perhaps, was someone who understood, who felt as she did, who might see her as she truly was, rather than as society demanded she appear. The Duke bowed over her hand, his touch lingering just a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she saw in his eyes a promise that tomorrow's call would indeed come. Then he was gone, claimed by Lady Somerton for introduction to other guests, and Penelope was left to face her mother's delighted interrogation whilst trying to make sense of the extraordinary shift that had occurred in the space of a single waltz. The morning following Lady Somerton's ball dawned bright and unseasonably warm, the kind of May morning that promised the fullness of summer to come. Penelope had slept poorly, her mind replaying every moment of her encounter with the Duke of Radcliffe, alternating between hope and self-castigation for allowing herself to read significance into what might have been mere politeness from a gentleman trapped by social obligation. By the time the clock struck 3, the earliest acceptable hour for morning calls despite the name's confusing nature, she had convinced herself that he would not come, that whatever connection she had felt during their dance had been nothing more than wishful thinking on her part. She stationed herself in the drawing room with needlework that received none of her attention, whilst her mother maintained a cheerful commentary about the previous evening's successes that did nothing to ease Penelope's nerves. When Graves, their butler, entered at precisely 3:15 to announce the Duke of Radcliffe, Penelope felt her heart perform an entirely undignified leap. Her mother's expression of triumph would have been amusing under other circumstances, and she made no attempt to excuse herself as chaperone, instead arranging herself in a chair positioned to observe whilst maintaining the fiction of being engaged with her own correspondence. The Duke entered the drawing room with the same careful formality she remembered from the previous evening, but when their eyes met, she saw relief flash across his features that surely mirrored her own. He bowed to her mother with appropriate deference before turning to Penelope, and she caught the ghost of a smile that suggested he found the entire ritual of morning calls as absurd as she did. "Lady Penelope," he said, taking the seat across from her that her mother indicated with a gracious gesture. "I hope you suffered no ill effects from last evening's festivities. The crush was rather overwhelming." "I am quite well, Your Grace," Penelope replied, falling into the expected patterns of polite exchange, whilst her mind raced ahead to how they might achieve any genuine conversation under her mother's watchful eye. Lady Somerton's events are always well attended. One might say, excessively so. One might indeed, he agreed, and there was that hint of humor again, subtle enough to escape her mother's notice, but clear enough to Penelope. "I confess I find the season somewhat daunting. My brother, the late Duke, was far more adept at navigating such social complexities. I am more accustomed to the quiet of our estate in Northumberland." This revelation caught Penelope's attention. "You manage the family estates yourself, then? That is rather unusual for a gentleman of your standing." She was aware, even as she spoke, that she had strayed from the safe topics of weather and social events that usually characterized morning calls, but the Duke's expression showed interest rather than disapproval. "I do. Or rather, I did, before—" He paused, and something complicated passed across his features. "Before my brother's death necessitated my assumption of responsibilities I had never expected to bear. I find I miss the practical engagement with land management and improvement. There is something satisfying about seeing direct results from one's efforts." Her mother made a small sound that might have been surprise or dismay at such an unpoetic topic, but Penelope leaned forward slightly, genuinely intrigued. "I imagine there is a considerable difference between managing a single estate and overseeing the various holdings of a dukedom. Do you find the additional responsibilities overwhelming?" "Overwhelming is an apt description," he said, and she heard in his voice the weight he carried. "Particularly as I must divide my time between estate management and the social obligations that my position now demands. I confess I am more suited to the former than the latter." They talked for the prescribed 15 minutes about estate management, agricultural improvements, and the challenges of balancing duty with inclination, whilst her mother's expression grew increasingly concerned at the unfashionable nature of their conversation. But Penelope found herself fascinated by the way the Duke's entire demeanor changed when discussing topics that clearly engaged his intellect and passion. The careful mask of formality fell away, revealing a man of considerable intelligence and unexpected idealism about improving conditions for his tenants. When the Duke finally rose to take his leave, having observed the proper timing with what seemed like genuine reluctance, he turned to Penelope's mother with a request that made the Countess's concerns evaporate like morning mist. "Lady Grantley, I wonder if you might permit me to escort Lady Penelope for a drive in Hyde Park tomorrow afternoon. Naturally, a maid would accompany us for propriety's sake." Her mother's agreement was immediate and enthusiastic, and Penelope felt a surge of anticipation that she tried desperately to keep from showing too obviously on her face. As the Duke bowed over her hand in farewell, she felt the pressure of his fingers, brief but deliberate, and saw in his eyes a promise that their conversation was far from finished. The drive in Hyde Park the following afternoon proved to be the first of many such outings over the subsequent weeks. The Duke called for Penelope in an elegant curricle drawn by a perfectly matched pair of greys, and with her maid, Julia positioned discreetly behind them, they joined the fashionable hour's parade of vehicles along Rotten Row. It was, Penelope reflected, the most public form of courtship imaginable, conducted before the interested eyes of all society, and yet somehow they managed to create an intimacy within those constraints. They talked endlessly, it seemed, about everything and nothing. The Duke, who insisted she call him Richard, though only when they were relatively private, possessed a mind that ranged widely, from politics to poetry, from philosophy to practical matters of running an estate. He was well-read without being pedantic, thoughtful without being ponderous, and possessed a dry wit that matched her own. More significantly, he listened when she spoke, actually considered her opinions rather than merely waiting for his turn to talk. "I had forgotten," he told her during one of their drives, "that conversation could be enjoyable rather than merely obligatory. Most social interactions feel rather like a chess game where everyone knows the moves in advance." "And what sort of game is this?" Penelope asked, gesturing between them with a gloved hand. "This," he said, his dark eyes holding hers, "is something entirely different. This is discovering that the board has more dimensions than I knew existed." But even as their connection deepened, Penelope became increasingly aware of the barriers that remained between them. Richard maintained a careful distance emotionally, retreating behind formality whenever their conversations ventured too close to truly personal territory. She learned about his childhood, his education, his relationship with his late brother, but always these revelations came filtered through a protective reserve that kept her from knowing him fully. For his part, Richard struggled visibly with the demands of his position. He was called upon to attend parliamentary sessions, to host dinners for political allies, to make appearances at social events that clearly exhausted him. Penelope watched him navigate these obligations with the same careful competence he brought to everything, but she could see the toll they took. He grew thinner as the season progressed, the shadows under his eyes deepening, and she worried about the price he was paying for duty. Their outings continued, becoming an established pattern that London society noted with interest. The gossip speculated about an impending engagement, whilst marriage-minded mamas whose daughters had been disappointed by his preference for Penelope spread rumors suggesting she had somehow trapped him through calculation. Penelope's own mother oscillated between delight at securing the attentions of a duke and anxiety that Richard had not yet made his intentions formally known. At a musical hosted by Lady Eleanor Fitzwilliam in late May, Penelope and Richard found themselves drawn together in a quieter corner of the drawing room, whilst a young soprano performed with more enthusiasm than skill. From across the room, Lady Eleanor observed them with keen interest, noting the way they leaned toward each other in conversation, the animation in their expressions, the obvious pleasure they took in each other's company. She recognized what she saw, a rare spark of genuine intellectual and emotional compatibility, so different from the tedious performances that characterized most courtships. Lady Eleanor made a mental note, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Interesting," she murmured to herself, a small smile playing at her lips. Very interesting indeed. One afternoon in early June, they found themselves alone in the library at Lady Northam's house party, as alone as they could be with Julia positioned just outside the door, examining a rare first edition that Richard had mentioned wanting to see. The room was cool and quiet, the afternoon light filtering through tall windows, and for a moment they simply stood together in companionable silence. "Penelope," Richard said suddenly, setting down the book he had been examining, "I must confess something to you. I fear I have been unfair." She turned to him, concern tightening in her chest at the strain in his voice. "Unfair? How so?" He moved to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens beyond, and she saw the tension in his shoulders. "I have sought your company persistently, monopolized your time this season, and yet I have been guarded. There are circumstances, complications in my life that I have not shared with you. It would be dishonorable to continue this connection without being more forthcoming." Penelope joined him at the window, maintaining proper distance but letting him see in her expression that she was ready to listen without judgment. "Then be forthcoming. I would rather know the truth, however complicated, than continue in uncertainty." He was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a burden long held. "My brother's death was not as sudden as society believes. He had been ill for some time, though he concealed it well. I knew his heart was failing, that his time was limited, but I did not expect him to leave me so abruptly. We had quarreled, you see, the week before he died. About duty, about responsibility, about—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words, "about the necessity of marriage for dynastic purposes rather than personal inclination." "He wished you to marry strategically," Penelope said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn. "He wished me to understand that the dukedom required an heir, that personal feelings were secondary to family obligation. And I told him that I would rather remain unmarried than enter into a loveless union merely to satisfy societal expectations." Those were the last words we exchanged. He died 3 days later, and I inherited not just his title, but his conviction that I was selfish and foolishly idealistic. Penelope absorbed this revelation, seeing in it the source of the conflict she had sensed in him from their first meeting. And now, you are torn between honoring his memory by doing your duty and honoring yourself by refusing to compromise on something as fundamental as choosing a wife. He turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. "Yes, exactly yes. And then I met you, and you were—" He stopped, shook his head. "You were everything I had not dared to hope existed. Someone who understood, who saw through the performance, who made me believe that perhaps both duty and genuine connection might be possible. But what if I am merely repeating the pattern my brother warned against? What if I am drawn to you precisely because you represent what I want to believe is possible rather than what is practical?" The question hung between them, painful in its honesty. Penelope felt her own defenses rising, the old fear that she was valued for what she represented rather than who she was. You think your regard for me might be an illusion? A convenient fiction you have constructed to justify your desires? I do not know, he said, and the admission clearly cost him. I do not trust my own judgment in this matter. My brother spent years navigating society, understanding its intricacies in ways I never learned. What if he was right? What if my idealism is simply naivety dressed in prettier clothing? Penelope felt something crack inside her, a protective wall she had built around the tender hope that had been growing since their first meeting. I see. And what would constitute proof to you? How might you determine whether what you feel is genuine rather than self-deception? He reached toward her, then stopped, propriety reasserting itself even in this moment of emotional extremity. I do not know that either. But you deserve more than a husband who questions his own heart. You deserve certainty, conviction, the kind of absolute assurance that I fear I cannot provide. What I deserve, Penelope said, her voice sharper than she intended, is to be consulted about what I want rather than having men make decisions about my future based on their own internal conflicts. You speak of honoring me by maintaining distance, but perhaps you are simply using your doubts as an excuse to avoid the risk of genuine vulnerability. She saw her words land, saw him flinch as though struck, and felt a surge of guilt mixed with frustration. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps signaled the end of their privacy. Lady Northam swept into the library with several other guests, her cheerful commentary about the books destroying any possibility of continuing their conversation. The remainder of the house party passed in a haze of strained politeness. Richard was unfailingly courteous, but he had retreated behind the formal mask she had come to recognize as his protective armor. When they returned to London 2 days later, he called upon her exactly once, bringing with him a rare book they had discussed as though nothing had transpired between them, staying precisely the prescribed 15 minutes before taking his leave with perfect formality. A week passed, then another, with no word beyond a note thanking her for her companionship during the season. Penelope found herself in the peculiar position of being not quite engaged, not quite discarded, suspended in an uncertainty that society found more scandalous than either clear outcome would have been. The whispers intensified. Had the Duke been trifling with her affections? Had she failed to secure him through some deficiency? Her mother grew increasingly agitated, suggesting they accept invitations to country house parties where other gentlemen might see her as available. The solution to their impasse came from an unexpected source, Lady Eleanor Fitzwilliam, a widow of middle years who was known throughout society as a woman of formidable intelligence and admirably little patience for nonsense. She had been observing the situation between Penelope and Richard with the sharp eyes of someone who understood human nature far better than most, and she decided, with characteristic directness, to intervene. Lady Eleanor hosted a small dinner party in mid-June, inviting only a carefully selected group that included both Penelope and Richard, among several other guests whose presence provided appropriate camouflage for her matchmaking schemes. The dinner itself passed pleasantly enough, the conversation ranging over topics of current interest whilst carefully avoiding anything too controversial. Penelope found herself seated at some distance from Richard, able to observe him whilst not being required to engage directly, and she noted that he looked haggard, as though he had been sleeping poorly. Following dinner, whilst the gentlemen remained at table and the ladies retired to the drawing room, Lady Eleanor maneuvered Penelope onto a settee slightly apart from the other guests. "You are miserable," she announced without preamble, her tone matter-of-fact rather than sympathetic. "And the Duke is equally so. This seems remarkably foolish when a solution exists." Penelope, startled by such directness, could only manage an inelegant, "I beg your pardon?" "Do not dissemble with me, child. I am too old and too experienced to be deceived by polite fictions. You have developed a genuine regard for Radcliffe. He reciprocates your feelings, and yet both of you are paralyzed by fear, dressed up as noble concern. It is exhausting to witness." "It is not so simple," Penelope protested, but even to her own ears, The objection sounded weak. "It rarely is," Lady Eleanor agreed, "which is precisely why I am interfering. Tell me, what do you believe prevents the Duke from declaring himself?" Penelope hesitated, loyalty warring with her need to unburden herself to someone who might understand. "He questions whether his regard for me is genuine or merely a convenient fiction that allows him to believe he can satisfy duty whilst following his heart. He fears he may be deceiving himself." Ah. Lady Eleanor's expression showed both understanding and impatience. "And you believe this doubt is an insurmountable obstacle? Is it not? How can I accept the devotion of a man who questions his own feelings?" "Every intelligent person questions their feelings, Lady Penelope. It is only fools who charge forward with absolute certainty. The question is not whether he doubts, but whether he is willing to move forward despite those doubts. Has he withdrawn from you entirely, or does he continue to seek your company whilst maintaining this maddening distance?" Penelope thought of the formal calls, the polite notes, the way his eyes followed her at social events, even whilst he kept physical and emotional distance. "The latter, I suppose. Then he is a fool, but a redeemable one. He needs someone to demonstrate that his fears, whilst understandable, are also surmountable. He needs proof that what he feels is substantial enough to build upon." Lady Eleanor leaned forward, her expression intense. "When the gentlemen rejoin us, I shall arrange for you and the Duke to examine some manuscripts in my private study. You will have perhaps 15 minutes of relative privacy before propriety demands someone intrude. Use that time wisely." Before Penelope could protest or even properly consider the implications, the gentlemen were indeed returning to the drawing room, and Lady Eleanor was rising to implement her scheme with the efficiency of a military general. Within moments, she had engineered the situation precisely as promised, and Penelope found herself walking beside Richard down a quiet corridor toward Lady Eleanor's study, her heart beating so forcefully she felt certain he must hear it. The study proved to be a smaller, more intimate space than the formal library, lined with books and manuscripts that spoke of Lady Eleanor's scholarly interests. A single lamp burned on the desk, casting warm light that created pockets of shadow in the corners. Richard closed the door behind them, leaving it ajar the prescribed few inches for propriety's sake, and for a moment they simply stood there, the weight of all their unspoken words filling the space between them. "This is rather obviously a scheme," Richard said at last, his voice carrying a note of rueful humor. "Lady Eleanor is not subtle in her machinations." "No," Penelope agreed, "but perhaps she is correct that we have been foolish. Certainly we have been miserable." He turned to face her fully, and in the lamplight, she could see the exhaustion in his features, the evidence of sleepless nights that matched her own. "I have been a coward," he said quietly. "I convinced myself that maintaining distance was protecting you, when truly I was only protecting myself from the vulnerability of being fully known and possibly rejected." "I would not have rejected you," Penelope said, taking a step closer, emboldened by the privacy and the knowledge that their time was limited. "I understood your doubts even when they hurt me. What wounded me was your unwillingness to trust that we might navigate those doubts together. I know." He closed his eyes briefly, as though in pain. "My brother and I, we were close once, before duty and expectation created distance between us. When he died, I inherited not just his title, but his unresolved conflicts, his certainty that I was too idealistic to survive in society's complexities. I have been trying to honor his memory by proving him wrong, and in the process, I nearly destroyed the one genuine connection I have found." Penelope felt tears prick at her eyes at the rawness in his voice. "You need not prove anything to your brother's ghost, Richard. He is beyond needing your vindication. What you must decide is what will allow you to live with yourself, what will let you look back without regret when you are old and your choices are behind you." He moved closer, near enough now that she could feel the warmth of him, see the rapid pulse at his throat that betrayed his agitation. "What I want," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is to stop pretending that I could ever be satisfied with a strategic marriage to someone who sees only my title. What I want is a partnership built upon genuine understanding and mutual respect. What I want is you, Penelope, if you would still have me despite my foolishness." Her breath caught at the declaration, at the vulnerability in his expression that matched the words. "What changed? What allowed you to move past your doubts?" "Lady Eleanor," he admitted with a ghost of a smile. "She cornered me before dinner and informed me that I was being an idiot. More specifically, she pointed out that my brother's certainty about the impossibility of combining duty with genuine affection stemmed from his own failures, not from any inherent truth about marriage. She suggested that I was allowing his disappointments to define my possibilities, and that this was both disrespectful to his memory and disastrous for my future." "She is remarkably forthright," Penelope observed, feeling laughter bubble up despite the seriousness of the moment. "She is remarkably correct," Richard countered. "I have been so focused on questioning whether my feelings were genuine that I failed to consider the most obvious evidence. That I have been profoundly unhappy without your company. That nothing in my life has felt right since I withdrew from you. That I dream of your voice and wake disappointed to find myself alone. If that is self-deception, it is remarkably persistent and thoroughly unpleasant." Penelope laughed then, properly laughed at the absurdity of his logic and the perfect honesty of it. "That is possibly the least romantic declaration of devotion I have ever heard." "I am not a romantic man," he said, but he was smiling now, really smiling, and the transformation was extraordinary. "I am practical and occasionally awkward and far more comfortable discussing crop rotation than poetry. But I am also absolutely certain that I want to spend my life having conversations that matter with the only person who has ever truly understood me. If you will accept such an unpoetic proposition." She reached out and took his hand. Propriety be damned, feeling the calluses on his palm that spoke of a man who did not merely oversee his estates, but worked them. "I would far rather have honesty than poetry. I would rather have a partner who struggles with uncertainty alongside me than one who offers false confidence. And I would very much like to stop performing society's expectations and simply be myself with someone who values that self." His fingers tightened around hers, and she saw in his eyes emotion so intense it made her breath catch. "Then marry me, Penelope, not because it satisfies duty or meets expectations, but because we choose each other freely, with full knowledge of each other's flaws and doubts and complications. Build a life with me where we can be authentically ourselves rather than society's versions of who we ought to be." "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying the weight of commitment and relief and joy all at once. "Yes, absolutely, yes." Richard raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that lingered long enough to send warmth flooding through her entire body. "I promise you," he said against her gloved fingers, "that I will never again doubt without voicing those doubts to you first. That I will trust you to help me navigate my uncertainties rather than retreating into isolation. That I will honor your mind and your spirit as much as society demands I honor your position as my wife. And I promise," Penelope replied, her voice thick with emotion, "to challenge you when you retreat behind propriety, to share my own doubts rather than pretending confidence I do not feel, and to build with you a marriage that others might consider unconventional, but that satisfies us both completely." They stood there, hands clasped, barely inches apart, sharing a moment of understanding so profound that words seemed inadequate to contain it. The sound of approaching footsteps reminded them of the world beyond this room, of proprieties to observe and announcements to make, but for this perfect suspended moment, they simply existed together, two souls who had found each other despite society's best efforts to keep them performing roles rather than living authentically. When Lady Eleanor entered the study moments later with Penelope's mother in tow, she took one look at their joined hands and clasped expressions and announced with evident satisfaction, "I take it, congratulations are in order?" "They are," Richard confirmed, his eyes never leaving Penelope's face. "If Lady Grantley will permit me to formally request her daughter's hand?" The Countess, who had been anxiously awaiting precisely this outcome for weeks, could only nod tearfully, whilst Lady Eleanor smiled with the smug satisfaction of a matchmaker whose schemes had succeeded brilliantly. Within the hour, the news had spread throughout Lady Eleanor's dinner party, and by the following morning, all of London would be discussing the engagement of the Duke of Radcliffe to Lady Penelope Hartwick, speculating endlessly about the romance that had bloomed under their very noses. But Penelope and Richard, caught in the whirlwind of congratulations and celebrations, cared very little about what society thought. They had found something far more valuable than approval. They had found each other, authentically and completely, and that was worth more than all the tons' approbation combined. The announcement of their engagement transformed Penelope's social position overnight. Where previously she had been simply another young lady navigating the marriage mart, she now found herself elevated to the status of future Duchess, with all the attention and scrutiny such a position entailed. Morning calls increased exponentially, invitations arrived in overwhelming abundance, and conversations that had previously been casual suddenly carried undertones of calculation as people sought to curry favor with the future Duchess of Radcliffe. Richard, for his part, seemed energized by their engagement rather than drained by it. The careful distance he had maintained throughout the season dissolved, replaced by a warmth that made Penelope's heart soar every time they were together. They were together often, propriety now permitting slightly longer and more frequent visits, and they used that time to plan their future in earnest detail rather than romantic vagaries. They would divide their time between London and Northumberland, Richard explained during one of their afternoon drives through Hyde Park, with the understanding that estate management would remain his primary occupation while she oversaw the social obligations that his position demanded. It was an unconventional arrangement that prioritized his strengths rather than forcing him into a mold that did not suit him. And Penelope found herself genuinely excited about the prospect of supporting him in this way, whilst also having sufficient independence to pursue her own interests. "I thought," Richard said one afternoon, as they sat in her family's drawing room with her mother, positioned discreetly in the corner, "that we might marry in early August, before the season ends, but after the current crush has diminished slightly. Would that suit you? I confess I am eager to begin our life together properly, rather than conducting it through these carefully chaperoned visits." "Early August would be perfect," Penelope agreed, warmth flooding through her at the undisguised longing in his voice. "It gives us time to make proper arrangements without unnecessary delay. Where did you envision the ceremony taking place?" "St. George's in Hanover Square, I suppose, as tradition dictates for a ducal wedding," he said, but she heard reluctance in his tone. "Though I confess I would prefer something smaller and more intimate if propriety permitted." "Perhaps we might compromise," Penelope suggested. "St. George's for the ceremony itself, as duty requires, but a smaller wedding breakfast with only family and close friends rather than the enormous affair society would expect." His expression brightened considerably. "That would be ideal. You see, this is precisely why we suit each other so well. You understand the necessity of satisfying certain obligations whilst finding ways to preserve what truly matters." Num. They were deep in discussion about guest lists and arrangements when Richard mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he would need to travel to Northumberland within the fortnight to address several urgent estate matters that had been neglected during his extended stay in London. "I shall be gone perhaps 3 weeks," he said, regret clear in his voice. "The timing is unfortunate, but the steward has written that several decisions require my immediate attention, and I cannot in good conscience continue to defer my responsibilities." "Of course you must go," Penelope assured him, though she felt a pang at the prospect of their separation. 3 weeks will pass quickly enough, and you will return in time for Lady Carrington's ball, which I believe is meant to be the event of late season. I shall write to you," he promised, taking her hand briefly, despite her mother's presence. Every day, lengthy letters detailing the thrilling intricacies of tenant disputes and crop yields, until you beg me to cease boring you with agricultural matters. I shall never find your letters boring, Penelope replied warmly. I want to know everything about the estate that will be our home. Every detail you share helps me envision our future life together. Richard departed for Northumberland 2 days later, and true to his word, letters began arriving with remarkable regularity. They were wonderful letters, full of detail about the estate, observations about the countryside, and increasingly personal reflections about his thoughts and feelings. Penelope treasured each one, reading them multiple times and crafting responses that she hoped conveyed the depth of her own affection without crossing into impropriety, given that their correspondence might theoretically be read by others. But as the first week stretched into the second, something began to shift. Richard's letters, while still regular, became shorter and more focused on practical estate matters. The personal observations and emotional warmth that had characterized his earlier correspondence diminished, replaced by updates about crop rotations and tenant negotiations that, whilst interesting enough, lacked the intimacy she had come to cherish. Penelope told herself she was being oversensitive, that he was simply busy with the pressing matters that had necessitated his journey. But when the third week arrived and his letters became even more perfunctory, reduced to brief notes that read more like reports to a business associate than correspondence with one's betrothed, she could not suppress a growing unease. The situation reached a crisis point when she attended Lady Worthing's garden party in the third week of Richard's absence. Lady Worthing, an older woman known for her sharp tongue and extensive network of informants, approached Penelope during the afternoon with an expression of sympathetic concern that immediately set alarm bells ringing. What Penelope did not know was that Lady Worthing's eldest daughter, Lady Anne, had harbored hopes of attracting the Duke's attention before his preference for Penelope had become apparent, and the matron's subsequent resentment had festered into something more deliberate than mere gossip. "My dear Lady Penelope," she began, her voice pitched to carry to the interested listeners surrounding them. "I feel I must speak with you privately. There are matters concerning the Duke of Radcliffe that you ought to know, painful though the knowledge may be." Penelope felt ice settle in her stomach, but maintained her composure as Lady Worthing guided her to a more secluded area of the garden, away from the most obvious eavesdroppers, though certainly not beyond the reach of speculation. "What matters?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "My niece resides in Northumberland, not far from the Duke's principal estate," Lady Worthing explained, her expression managing to convey both concern and a certain satisfaction at being the bearer of important intelligence. Satisfaction that stemmed not merely from her love of gossip, but from seeing a rival to her daughter's prospects facing difficulties. "She has written to me about certain developments that she felt I should know, given the Duke's engagement to you." "Developments?" Penelope repeated, though she was not entirely certain she wanted to hear what would follow. "The Duke has been entertaining a particular lady with some frequency since his arrival in the north. Miss Georgiana Sutherland, daughter of Sir Thomas Sutherland, whose lands adjoin Radcliffe's estate. She is a beautiful creature, accomplished and charming, and there are those who say the Duke had a significant attachment to her some years ago before his brother's death elevated his circumstances." Lady Worthing paused, allowing the implications to settle. "My niece reports that they have been seen together often, driving out without proper chaperonage, spending extended periods in private conversation. There is considerable speculation locally about the nature of their renewed acquaintance." Penelope felt the world tilt slightly, but years of social training allowed her to maintain outward calm even as her mind raced. "I see. And your niece felt this information warranted disturbing his engagement? My dear, I tell you this only because I believe you deserve to know if the Duke's affections are not as fixed as he has led you to believe. There is no shame in ending an engagement if one party proves unworthy of trust. Better to discover such things now than after vows have been exchanged. I thank you for your concern, Penelope managed, though the words felt like shards of glass in her throat. However, I have complete faith in the Duke's honor and devotion. I am certain there is an innocent explanation for whatever your niece observed. But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in with poisonous tendrils. Richard's letters had become distant and perfunctory. He had extended his stay in Northumberland by several days beyond his original plan, citing additional matters requiring attention. And now, this intelligence about another woman, someone with whom he shared history, someone who lived in the place he clearly preferred to London society. Penelope managed to endure the remainder of the garden party, deflecting concerned inquiries and pointed questions with the social skills she had honed over 4 seasons. But once she returned home, she retreated to her bedchamber and reread Richard's recent letters with new eyes, finding in their impersonal tone evidence of cooling affection rather than simple business. She tried to reason through her doubts logically. Richard had been utterly transparent about his struggles with trust and certainty. He had promised to voice his uncertainties rather than retreating in silence. Surely, if he were having second thoughts about their engagement, he would tell her directly rather than simply withdrawing. But another voice, cruel and insistent, suggested that perhaps his earlier doubts had been prophetic. Perhaps he had recognized instinctively that his regard for her was not deep enough to sustain a marriage. Perhaps returning to his beloved Northumberland had reminded him of what he truly valued, and perhaps Miss Sutherland represented a connection rooted in shared history and genuine compatibility rather than the desperate grasping for understanding that had characterized his relationship with Penelope. The rational part of her mind insisted she should write to him directly, ask for clarification, trust in the honesty that had defined their courtship. But wounded pride and growing fear stopped her hand. Writing to him would be admitting that the rumors affected her, a vulnerability that her pride would not permit. Worse, it would be forcing him to a confession that might humiliate her publicly. If the doubts he had already expressed about their marriage had indeed returned with renewed force, she preferred to discover this through his silence and dignified withdrawal than through a letter spelling out his rejection in painful detail. The memory of his previous uncertainties, his questions about whether his feelings were genuine or merely convenient fiction, now seemed prophetic rather than resolved. When Richard's next letter arrived 2 days later, Penelope could barely bring herself to open it. The missive was brief, mentioning that he would be delayed in Northumberland for another week as complications had arisen with a tenant dispute that required his personal attention. He hoped she was well, trusted she was enjoying the remaining season events, and would write more fully when time permitted. There was nothing overtly damning in the content, but the emotional distance, combined with Lady Worthing's intelligence, painted a picture that grew more painful with each passing hour. Richard was clearly avoiding returning to London, avoiding facing her, perhaps struggling with how to end an engagement he had entered into impulsively during a moment of romantic idealism. Penelope's mother, noticing her distress but misinterpreting its source, attempted to reassure her that pre-wedding nerves were entirely natural and that the Duke's devotion was beyond question. But her reassurances only made matters worse, highlighting how thoroughly Penelope had fooled even those closest to her about the depth of her doubts. By the time the 4th week of Richard's absence began, Penelope had convinced herself of a terrible truth, that Richard had recognized the same thing his brother had tried to warn him about, that romantic idealism was insufficient foundation for the practical realities of an aristocratic marriage. He had found in Miss Sutherland what Penelope could never provide, a connection rooted in shared history and genuine preference for the rural life he valued above all else. He was delaying his return to London because he dreaded the conversation they must eventually have, the painful acknowledgement that their engagement had been a mistake. The thought of facing society's pity, her mother's disappointment, and her own shattered hopes became unbearable. When Lady Carrington's invitation arrived for her celebrated ball, the event Richard had promised to attend, Penelope made a decision born of pain and pride. She would end their engagement herself, sparing him the necessity of rejecting her and preserving what dignity she could from the wreckage of her hopes. She sat down to compose what was possibly the most difficult letter she had ever written, informing Richard that upon reflection, she believed they had been hasty in their engagement, that their differences in temperament and preference were more significant than they had initially acknowledged, and that she was releasing him from any obligation to her. She wished him every happiness in his future, hoped they might remain cordial when circumstances forced them into company, and trusted he would understand that this decision was for the best. Her hand trembled as she sealed the letter and gave it to Graves for immediate posting. The deed done, she retreated to her bedchamber and allowed herself to weep for the first time since Lady Worthing's revelation, mourning not just the loss of Richard, but the death of her belief that genuine connection was possible within the constraints of her world. Richard received Penelope's letter at his Northumberland estate on a grey morning that matched his spirits perfectly. He had been awake since dawn, finally completing the complicated negotiations that had kept him in the north far longer than he had intended, and he was planning his departure for London when the post arrived. Seeing Penelope's familiar handwriting brought immediate pleasure that transformed to confusion and then horror as he read her words. He read the letter 3 times, trying to understand how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. 4 weeks ago, they had been happily planning their wedding, discussing their future with genuine excitement. His letters to her had necessarily become briefer as the crisis with his tenants consumed more of his time and energy, but he had assumed she would understand the temporary nature of this distraction. How had she moved from planning their marriage to ending their engagement in the space of a month? The answer, when it came, arrived in the form of his steward entering the study with an apologetic expression. "Your Grace, I hesitate to mention this given your obvious distress, but there is a rumor circulating that I believe you should be aware of." Richard listened with growing fury as his steward explained that gossip had reached London, suggesting inappropriate intimacy between the Duke and Miss Georgiana Sutherland. The steward had heard whispers from servants who had traveled between estates, suggesting that talk of the Duke's frequent visits to the Sutherland property had been misinterpreted and spread to the capital through various channels. "There is talk that you have been seen together often, Your Grace, driving out and spending considerable time in private conversation. I fear some have drawn improper conclusions about the nature of your business with Sir Thomas." "Business being precisely what it is," Richard said grimly. "Miss Sutherland's father and I have been negotiating a solution to the flooding problems affecting both our lands. The young lady herself has been present at some meetings because she will inherit the estate upon her father's death and needed to understand the agreements being reached. There was nothing remotely romantic about our interactions. Of course, Your Grace, those of us here understood the nature of your business, but rumors, once started, travel quickly and grow in the telling." Richard felt sick as he understood what must have happened. Penelope had somehow learned of these rumors, and lacking any contradictory information from his own inadequate letters, had concluded they were true. She had ended their engagement not because her feelings had changed, but because she believed his had, because she thought he had betrayed her trust with another woman. The realization was followed immediately by another, equally devastating. He had failed to keep his promise to her. He had sworn to voice his doubts and concerns rather than retreating into silence, to trust her, to help him navigate difficulties rather than handling them alone. Instead, he had become so consumed with estate matters that he had neglected the very relationship he claimed to value above all else. He had allowed his letters to become perfunctory, had failed to explain adequately why his stay extended beyond original plans, had essentially demonstrated through his actions that she was less important than tenant disputes and land negotiations. Small wonder she had concluded the worst. He had given her every reason to doubt his devotion, whilst providing no evidence to counter the poisonous rumors that had obviously reached her ears. And Penelope, proud and wounded, had chosen to end matters herself rather than confront him with accusations. She had done exactly what he might have predicted given her character, protected her dignity by assuming control of a situation that seemed to be spiraling beyond her influence. Richard sat for a long moment, Penelope's letter clutched in his hand, feeling the weight of his failure pressing upon him. He had spent so much time worrying about whether his feelings were genuine that he had failed to tend to the relationship itself, had allowed it to wither through neglect whilst he focused on matters he deemed more pressing. His brother would have laughed at the irony. Richard had feared repeating patterns of loveless aristocratic marriage only to destroy a genuine connection through the same prioritization of duty over relationship that had characterized his brother's own failed unions. But understanding his failure was insufficient. He needed to act, to prove to Penelope that his regard for her had never wavered despite his inexcusable neglect. He needed to demonstrate through deed, rather than mere words, that she was, in fact, his highest priority, more important than estates or duties or any other obligation his position imposed. Richard summoned his valet and began issuing rapid instructions for immediate departure. London was 3 days' hard travel from Northumberland, and every hour of delay increased the risk that Penelope would fortify her heart against him beyond any possibility of repair. He would ride rather than take a carriage, changing horses at posting inns, sacrificing comfort for speed in a manner that would scandalize proper society, but which felt entirely necessary given the stakes. During the brutal ride south, Richard had ample time to analyze his catastrophic failure with the cold clarity of desperation. He reviewed the disaster methodically. Private communication had failed spectacularly. His letters had been inadequate, leaving Penelope vulnerable to doubt. His discretion had only allowed rumors to flourish in darkness, unchallenged and unchecked. He understood with brutal clarity that the damage had been caused by public perception and could only be repaired by an equally public demonstration. The retraction needed to be so absolute and undeniable that it left no room for further gossip or doubt. Humiliation would be the price, but restoring Penelope's trust was the only outcome that mattered. He had tried the reserved approach and failed catastrophically. Now, he would employ the opposite tactic, radical, dramatic, and irrevocable. Before departing, however, he needed to address the source of the rumors. He rode to the Sutherland estate and requested an immediate interview with both Sir Thomas and Miss Georgiana, explaining the situation with a bluntness that would have been inappropriate under other circumstances, but which seemed warranted given the damage already done. "I need you to write to London society," he told Sir Thomas without preamble, explaining the nature of our business negotiations and making absolutely clear that no romantic involvement exists between your daughter and myself. "I suspect Lady Worthing may be behind the spread of these rumors. She is known throughout the ton as a notorious gossip. Include whatever details are necessary to establish the complete innocence of our interactions. My engagement to Lady Penelope Hartwick has been endangered by malicious speculation, and I need your help to repair the damage." Sir Thomas, a practical man who understood both the importance of the land negotiations and the danger of allowing rumors to fester, agreed immediately. Miss Georgiana, who proved to be an intelligent young woman with no romantic interest in Richard whatsoever, offered to write a separate letter describing her own complete lack of attachment to the Duke and expressing her hope that his engagement would proceed as planned. "I shall address mine to Lady Worthing specifically," Sir Thomas said, "as you suspect she is the source. If she has any honor at all, she will retract whatever falsehoods she has spread." These letters dispatched with instructions that they be sent by the fastest possible means, Richard began his journey to London with grim determination. The ride gave him ample time to reflect upon his mistakes and to plan how he might possibly convince Penelope to reconsider her decision. Words alone would be insufficient. He had proven himself unreliable as a correspondent. He needed to demonstrate through action that she was his priority, that no estate matter or family obligation would ever again take precedence over their relationship. The answer, when it came to him somewhere during the second day of hard riding, was both obvious and terrifying. He would need to be willing to sacrifice the very thing that had kept him from her in the first place. He would need to prove that his love for her exceeded his attachment to managing his estates personally, exceeded even his desire to escape London society's demands. He would need to offer her what he had claimed to value most and trust her to help him find a compromise that satisfied them both. By the time Richard reached London on the third day, exhausted and travel-stained but driven by desperate purpose, he had formulated a plan. It was dramatic, possibly foolish, and would require perfect timing and considerable courage. But if it succeeded, it might prove to Penelope what words alone could never convey, that she was not simply important to him, but essential, the center around which everything else in his life should properly revolve. Lady Carrington's ball, he learned upon inquiring at his London residence, was scheduled for that very evening. Penelope would certainly attend despite their broken engagement. Pride and social obligation would demand it. He would have one chance to make his case publicly before all of society, in a manner that left no room for doubt about the sincerity of his devotion or the permanence of his commitment. Richard bathed, dressed in his finest evening clothes, and arrived at Lady Carrington's residence just as the ball was reaching its height. He could feel the ripple of awareness that moved through the crowd as he entered, the way conversations paused and resumed with increased animation as society noted the Duke's unexpected appearance. His broken engagement to Lady Penelope was obviously common knowledge, and his presence promised drama that the Tun would dissect for weeks to come. He found Penelope standing near the musicians' gallery, her chin raised in defiant dignity that made his chest ache. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that brought out the gray-green of her eyes, and she was surrounded by several gentlemen whose attentive manner suggested they saw opportunity in her newly available status. When she noticed Richard's arrival, he saw shock flash across her features before she schooled them into careful neutrality. Richard crossed the ballroom with single-minded purpose, aware of the absolute silence that fell as society recognized what was about to occur. He bowed before Penelope with absolute formality, ignoring the interested gentleman who stepped back uncertainly. "Lady Penelope," he said, his voice carrying in the hushed room, "I understand you believe our engagement to be ended. I am here to convince you otherwise if you will grant me the courtesy of a hearing." She stood frozen, clearly torn between pride and curiosity, between the desire to maintain her dignified withdrawal and the need to understand what had driven him to create such a public scene. "Your Grace," she said at last, her voice admirably steady, though he could see the rapid pulse at her throat betraying her agitation. "This is hardly the appropriate venue for such a conversation." "On the contrary," Richard replied, "it is the perfect venue. You ended our engagement based upon rumors and appearances, upon the evidence of my negligent correspondence and apparent neglect. I intend to address those failures before all of London society so that you may judge the sincerity of my devotion not simply by my words, but by my willingness to humble myself publicly in pursuit of your forgiveness." He heard gasps around the room, saw Penelope's eyes widen in shock, and pressed forward before courage could desert him. "The rumors concerning Miss Georgiana Sutherland are utterly false. My business in Northumberland concerned complicated land negotiations with her father regarding river boundaries and flooding prevention. Miss Sutherland herself will confirm, as will her father, that our interactions were entirely professional and properly chaperoned. They are writing to Lady Worthing, even now, to correct the malicious gossip that has caused such damage." He paused, seeing uncertainty beginning to replace some of the hurt in Penelope's expression. "But the rumors, whilst false, are not the true source of our difficulty. The true problem is that I failed to maintain adequate communication with you whilst I was away. I allowed estate matters to consume my attention to the exclusion of what should have been my highest priority, nurturing our relationship and ensuring you never doubted my devotion. I broke the promise I made to you, to trust you with my concerns rather than handling difficulties in isolation. For that failure, I offer my most profound apologies." The ballroom remained utterly silent, hundreds of people witnessing what should have been a private conversation, but which Richard had deliberately made public. Penelope's hand had risen to her throat, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes, though she blinked them back with visible effort. "I love you, Penelope," Richard continued, his voice breaking slightly on her name. "I love your intelligence, your honesty, your courage in remaining authentic in a world that demands performance. I love the way you challenge me to be better whilst accepting my imperfections with grace. I love the future we plan together, built upon genuine partnership rather than conventional expectations. And I am prepared to prove that love through whatever sacrifice you demand. He dropped to one knee before her, ignoring the collective gasp that swept through the watching crowd at such unprecedented drama. If you require me to give up personal management of my estates, to hire stewards to handle all practical matters whilst I remain in London attending to society's demands, I will do so. If you require me to demonstrate through months or years of patient courtship that my devotion is permanent and unwavering, I will wait as long as necessary. If you require me to grovel publicly for forgiveness, to abase myself before all of London society, I am on my knees prepared to do exactly that. Whatever you need from me to believe that you are my priority above all else, I will provide. Penelope was openly weeping now, tears streaming down her face whilst she looked at him with an expression that combined hurt and hope and dawning understanding. "You would truly give up the estate management you love?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying in the absolute silence. "You would sacrifice the work that brings you genuine satisfaction simply to prove your devotion?" "I would," Richard said simply. "Because a life spent managing estates perfectly whilst failing in the most important relationship I have ever known would be no life at all. You are worth more than any duty, any obligation, any personal satisfaction I might derive from country pursuits." I was slow to understand that truth, but I understand it absolutely now. You are essential, Penelope. Everything else is negotiable. He saw her hand tremble as she extended it toward him, and then she was pulling him to his feet with a strength that belied her delicate appearance. "You are a fool," she said, but her voice held affection rather than criticism. "Excessive, utterly ridiculous fool who has just created the most enormous scandal by proposing on bended knee in the middle of Lady Carrington's ballroom." "Does that mean," he asked, hardly daring to hope, "that you forgive my neglect? That you might consider reinstating our engagement?" "It means," Penelope replied, and he saw a smile beginning to curve her lips despite her tears, "that we apparently have much to discuss about finding balance between your responsibilities and our relationship. It means that I overreacted to rumors without seeking clarification from you directly, which was as much a failure of trust on my part as your poor correspondence was on yours. And it means, you impossible man, that yes, I will marry you, provided you never again leave me in uncertainty for a month whilst estate matters consume your attention." Richard felt something tight and painful loosen in his chest, replaced by a joy so intense it was almost overwhelming. "I promise," he said fervently, no longer caring that they were the center of attention for all of London society. "I promise to write daily, to explain fully any demands on my time, to trust you as a true partner in managing the complications of our life together. I promise that you will never again doubt your importance to me." She stepped closer, propriety thoroughly abandoned, and raised her hand to his face with a gentleness that made his breath catch. "And I promise to voice my concerns rather than retreating into wounded pride, to trust that the connection we have built is strong enough to survive misunderstandings and mistakes, to believe in your devotion even when circumstances make it difficult to perceive." Around them, the ballroom erupted into applause and excited chatter as society began to process what they had just witnessed. Lady Carrington looked torn between horror at the impropriety and delight at hosting the season's most dramatic event. Penelope's mother had her handkerchief pressed to her mouth, eyes streaming with tears that might have been distress or joy or some complicated mixture of both. But Richard and Penelope, hands clasped and gazes locked, cared nothing for society's response. They had found each other again, had survived the test of misunderstanding, and emerged with deeper appreciation for what they had nearly lost. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with honesty and trust and the kind of love that grows stronger through adversity rather than being weakened by it. Richard sat at the escritoire in his study 3 days after the dramatic scene at Lady Carrington's ball, composing yet another letter to Penelope despite having seen her only hours earlier. The daily correspondence had become his ritual, a tangible demonstration of his commitment to maintaining clear communication regardless of physical proximity. This particular letter detailed his morning meetings with his steward about hiring additional estate managers, interspersed with observations about an amusing incident involving his valet and a recalcitrant cravat that he thought would make her laugh. When Penelope arrived for their afternoon drive, he handed her the sealed letter with a slightly sheepish expression. "I know I shall see you tomorrow as well, but I promised daily letters, and I find I rather enjoy the practice of recording my thoughts for you." She accepted the letter with visible pleasure, tucking it into her reticule to read later. "I treasure each one. They help me feel connected to your daily life, to understand the concerns that occupy your mind even when we are together." As they settled into his curricle for their drive through Hyde Park, their conversation turned naturally to the practical arrangements of their upcoming marriage. Richard had already implemented the first stages of his promised reorganization, interviewing candidates for a senior steward position that would allow him to maintain oversight whilst delegating day-to-day management. "I have been thinking," Penelope said as they joined the fashionable parade along Rotten Row, "about how we might structure our time between London and Northumberland. What if we established a pattern of extended visits rather than constant travel? 3 months in the country during planting and harvest seasons, with you handling major decisions whilst the stewards manage routine matters. Then sufficient time in London to fulfill your parliamentary duties and our social obligations, but without feeling compelled to attend every function." Richard felt warmth spread through his chest at her use of "we" and "our," at the way she approached their future as a genuine partnership requiring both their input. That could work admirably. And perhaps during our London residence, we might host smaller gatherings focused on substantive conversation rather than mere display. I have discovered that I do not mind social interaction when it serves a purpose beyond performance. "I would enjoy that very much," Penelope agreed. "We could create a salon of sorts, inviting people whose company we genuinely value rather than simply fulfilling social obligations." They discussed these plans with growing enthusiasm, each suggestion building upon the last, creating a vision of married life that honored both Richard's need for meaningful work and their mutual desire for authentic connection. The compromises felt natural rather than forced, born from genuine understanding of each other's needs and preferences. "You know," Richard said as they completed their circuit of the park, "when my brother argued that duty and personal happiness were incompatible, I think he was describing his own experience rather than stating a universal truth. He never found someone willing to help him create something different." "We are fortunate," Penelope replied softly, "to have found each other. And wise enough, I hope, to protect what we have built." The weeks leading to their wedding passed in a flurry of preparations and adjustments. Lady Worthing, confronted with Sir Thomas Sutherland's detailed letter explaining the innocent nature of the Duke's visits and Miss Georgiana's firm declaration of disinterest, found herself obligated to publicly retract her earlier implications. She did so with as much grace as she could muster, claiming misunderstanding rather than malice, though her reputation as a reliable source of intelligence suffered considerable damage. Her daughter, Lady Anne, whose disappointed hopes had partly motivated her mother's interference, was quickly betrothed to a baronet and removed from London society's immediate scrutiny. The ceremony at St. George's in Hanover Square took place on a brilliant August morning, with all the traditional splendor such occasions demanded. The church overflowed with society's most prominent members, the flowers were magnificent, and the Bishop of London himself officiated with appropriate solemnity. But for Penelope, standing beside Richard as they exchanged their vows, the crowd and ceremony faded into insignificance. His voice was steady as he pledged himself to her, each word a promise she knew he would honor with his entire being. Her own voice wavered with emotion, but she met his gaze directly as she made her vows, feeling the profound weight of what they were creating together. When they sealed their marriage with a kiss, chaste by necessity given the watching assembly, she saw in his eyes a depth of devotion that made her breath catch. The wedding breakfast that followed, held at Grantley House with only their closest family and friends, proved everything they had hoped. Conversation flowed naturally, laughter punctuated the elegant meal, and Penelope found herself repeatedly meeting Richard's gaze across the table, sharing private smiles that spoke of their joy. Her father's toast surprised her with its emotional depth. "My daughter has always possessed an independence of spirit that sometimes worried her mother and me," the Earl said, his voice rough with feeling. She refused to accept conventional wisdom about marriage, insisted on holding out for genuine connection even when practicality suggested she compromise. "Today, I see the wisdom of her stubbornness. The Duke of Radcliffe is a fortunate man, and I trust he appreciates the treasure he has gained." "I do, sir," Richard replied immediately, rising to his feet. "More than I can adequately express. Your daughter has taught me that authenticity matters more than performance, that genuine partnership requires vulnerability, and that love worth having is worth fighting for, even when the battle means admitting one's own failures. I promise you that I will spend my life ensuring she never regrets the trust she has placed in me." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to many eyes. The Countess, her own cheeks wet with emotion, leaned toward her daughter and whispered with a trembling smile, "Your father is right. Your stubbornness was, in the end, wisdom. I am immensely proud of the woman you have become, Penelope. I see that now." Penelope felt her vision blur as she squeezed her mother's hand, a moment of understanding passing between them that required no further words. She comprehended then that the union she was forming was not a tale of instant certainties like those celebrated in romantic fiction, but something more complex and therefore more genuine. Two imperfect souls choosing each other despite their flaws, committed to the continuous work of building a partnership that could truly endure. As the afternoon gave way to evening and guests began departing with final congratulations, Penelope stood in the entrance hall of her childhood home, accepting farewell embraces from her family. The familiar rooms and corridors that had sheltered her entire life suddenly felt distant, already part of her past rather than her present. Tomorrow she would wake as the Duchess of Radcliffe, would begin navigating the challenges and joys of married life, would discover who she might become alongside the man she had chosen. Richard seemed to sense her momentary disorientation, and he drew her slightly apart from the others, his hand warm and steadying at her elbow. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly, concern evident in his expression. "Not second thoughts," Penelope assured him. "Just awareness. Everything is different now." "Everything is different," he agreed. "But we face the differences together. That is what marriage means, is it not? Whatever complications arise, whatever challenges we encounter, we navigate them as partners rather than individuals." She leaned against him slightly, drawing comfort from his solidity. "I am glad it is you. I am glad that of all the gentlemen I might have chosen, I found the one who understands that marriage is not an ending, but a beginning. That the work of building a life together is meaningful precisely because it requires effort and honesty and constant renegotiation." "I am glad it is you," he echoed, his voice thick with emotion. "My stubborn, brilliant, beautiful Penelope, who refused to settle for less than she deserved, and who somehow decided that I was worthy of her trust, despite considerable evidence to the contrary." "You proved yourself worthy," she reminded him. "You made mistakes, but you owned them. You promised to do better, and you have demonstrated through action that your promises have substance. That matters more than perfection." The carriage awaited to take them to Richard's residence, and after final tearful embraces from her mother and sisters, Penelope allowed Richard to hand her inside. As the vehicle pulled away from Grantley House, she looked back at the lit windows, at the familiar facade that had been her whole world, and felt a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation that was almost overwhelming. "Are you nervous?" Richard asked as they settled into their seats, his hand finding hers in the dimness. Penelope considered the question honestly. "A little. about the physical intimacy, about managing a ducal household, about all the ways I might fail to meet expectations. But more than nervous, I am excited. Excited to finally have the privacy to be fully ourselves with each other. Excited to begin building the life we have planned. Excited to discover who we become together rather than who we were separately. Richard raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that lingered with clear intent. Whatever nervousness you feel, we will navigate it together. I promise to be patient, to communicate clearly, to ensure that you never doubt you are cherished and valued, tonight, tomorrow, and all the days that follow. The remainder of the short journey passed in comfortable silence, both of them aware of the significance of what awaited them. When they arrived at Radcliffe House, Richard dismissed the servants waiting to attend them, insisting they needed no assistance. He led Penelope up the grand staircase to the ducal apartments, rooms that had been thoroughly prepared for the new Duchess's arrival. The bedroom was beautiful, decorated in shades of cream and gold with touches of the deep blue Richard had learned she favored. The air was perfumed with the delicate fragrance of white roses and beeswax polish, and the only sound in the comfortable silence was the gentle crackling of the fire in the grate, its warmth more comforting than necessary given the season. It was a room designed for partnership, and Penelope felt her nervousness ease slightly, even as excitement fluttered in her chest. Richard seemed to sense her mixed emotions, and rather than immediately moving toward the bed, he guided her to the window seat overlooking the gardens. They sat together, as they had during their courtship, close but not quite touching, and simply talked. He shared his hopes for the estate improvements he wanted to implement, about projects that would benefit both the land and the tenants who worked it. She described her ideas for charitable work in London, about educational initiatives she hoped to support, about the difference she wanted to make as a duchess beyond mere social entertaining. The conversation was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, a reminder that their marriage was built on more than physical attraction or social advantage. They genuinely enjoyed each other's company, found pleasure in sharing thoughts and dreams and plans for their future. The intimacy of this exchange was its own form of union, a joining of minds and spirits that preceded and enhanced the physical connection to come. When they finally moved toward the bed, it was with a naturalness that eased Penelope's remaining nervousness. Richard was patient and gentle, his touch reverent as he helped her with the fastenings of her gown, his kisses tender as he communicated without words how precious she was to him. What followed was not the polished perfection one might read about in romantic novels, but something more authentic and therefore more meaningful. Two people learning each other, making discoveries, building intimacy through vulnerability and trust. Afterwards, lying together in the darkness with Richard's arms wrapped around her, Penelope felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was what she had been seeking through all those exhausting seasons, through all the disappointing encounters with gentlemen who saw only her surface qualities. This sense of being known completely and loved not despite her authentic self, but because of it. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the words inadequate to contain the depth of what she felt, but needing to be said nonetheless. "I love you," Richard replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I knew it was possible to love another person. You have transformed my life from a series of obligations I endured into something I genuinely want to experience. That is a gift beyond measure." They talked into the early morning hours, sometimes seriously and sometimes with laughter, building the foundation of their marriage through the sharing of hopes and fears and dreams. When they finally slept, it was with the peaceful certainty of two people who had found in each other something rare and precious. A partnership built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the courage to be vulnerable. The years that followed proved the wisdom of their choice. They divided their time between London and Northumberland as planned, and Penelope discovered genuine pleasure in learning estate management alongside Richard. She brought fresh perspectives that complemented his experience, suggesting innovations that improved tenant welfare whilst increasing productivity. Their marriage became known not for romantic drama, but for practical partnership, a model of how aristocratic unions might function when built on genuine compatibility rather than mere convenience. Children came in due course, 3 daughters and 2 sons, who inherited their parents' intelligence and independence of spirit. Richard and Penelope raised them with the same honesty that characterized their own relationship, teaching them that authenticity mattered more than performance, that genuine connection required vulnerability, and that love worth having demanded constant tending and care. They were not perfect. They argued occasionally, usually about Richard's tendency to become absorbed in estate projects at the expense of other obligations, or about Penelope's habit of taking on too many charitable commitments simultaneously. There were moments of frustration when their different temperaments clashed, times when miscommunication created temporary distance. But they had learned from their early crisis that honesty and willingness to admit fault mattered more than never making mistakes. They talked through their disagreements, apologized when necessary, and consistently chose each other even when choosing required effort. London society, initially scandalized by the Duke's public declaration and the couple's unconventional approach to marriage, eventually came to regard them with grudging respect. They were obviously devoted to each other in a way that seemed almost unfashionable, preferring each other's company to the endless social whirl, prioritizing their family over society's demands. Yet they also fulfilled their obligations with grace, hosting thoughtful gatherings, supporting important causes, and raising children who understood both privilege and responsibility. Lady Eleanor Fitzwilliam, who had orchestrated their reconciliation and remained a close friend throughout their lives, observed on multiple occasions that the Duke and Duchess of Radcliffe proved what she had always maintained: that intelligence combined with honesty created stronger marriages than rigid adherence to convention ever could. Those who had witnessed Richard's dramatic proposal at Lady Carrington's ball never forgot the sight of a duke on his knees, publicly declaring his willingness to sacrifice everything for the woman he cherished. It became one of those stories society told and retold, embellishing slightly with each retelling, but never quite capturing the genuine emotion that had transformed that moment into something transcendent. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Richard and Penelope found themselves once again in London for the season, though now as parents shepherding their eldest daughter through the complicated rituals of finding a suitable match. They stood together at a ball remarkably similar to the one where they had first met, watching the young people dance and navigate the same social complexities they had once found so exhausting. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked quietly, his hand finding Penelope's with the ease of long familiarity. "The unconventional path we chose, the complications we might have avoided had we followed society's expectations more closely?" Penelope looked up at her husband, seeing in his face the lines that 2 decades of life had etched, but also the warmth in his eyes that had first captured her attention all those years ago. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "We built something real, Richard. Not perfect, but real. Our children know what genuine partnership looks like. Our tenants benefit from innovations we developed together. And I wake every morning beside someone who still sees me, truly sees me, after 20 years of marriage. That is worth every complication, every moment of difficulty, every sacrifice we made." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with the same tender reverence he had shown on their wedding night. "You are still the best decision I ever made, the bravest choice, the one that required me to trust that authenticity mattered more than performance. Thank you for refusing to settle for less than you deserved. Thank you for demanding that I be better than I thought I could be. Thank you for building this life with me." Around them, the ball continued. Young people seeking love or advantage, or some combination of both. Parents calculating matches and weighing alliances. Society performing its endless dance of courtship and negotiation. But Richard and Penelope, hands clasped and hearts aligned, existed slightly apart from it all. They had learned what so few couples discovered: that marriage was not a destination, but a journey, not a solution, but a framework within which two people could grow and change and discover who they might become together. Their eldest daughter, observing her parents from across the ballroom, saw the way they stood together, the unspoken communication that passed between them, the obvious affection that time had deepened rather than diminished. She thought of the gentleman who had called upon her this season, the careful performances and calculated compliments, and wondered if she might find what her parents had found. Someone who saw beyond surface to substance, who valued authenticity over appearance, who would be partner rather than merely husband. It would not be easy, she knew. Her mother had searched for 4 seasons before finding her father, had nearly lost him through misunderstanding and pride, had worked consistently to build the marriage they now enjoyed. But watching them now, seeing the quiet joy they took in each other's presence even after 20 years, she thought perhaps the effort would be worthwhile. Perhaps the best things in life required patience and courage and willingness to demand more than society deemed reasonable. And so, another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society. Not the effortless love of romantic fiction, perhaps, but something more durable and more precious. The love that grows from genuine knowing, that survives misunderstanding through commitment to honesty, that transforms 2 imperfect individuals into partners who make each other better. The Duke and Duchess of Radcliffe built their happiness not despite their struggles, but through them, proving that authenticity, whilst difficult, yields rewards that performance never could. And in a world that often valued appearance over substance, their example suggested that perhaps the most radical act of all was simply choosing to be real.